Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North, and this the next episode in the Wakefield Prison series. Before I proceed, I wish to give a shout out to Sharon, who correctly guessed the subject of these episodes. Sharon, you have been a wonderful supporter of the podcast, and it is always a joy to chat to you on the page. While researching this case, I couldn't help note the striking similarities between the focus of this episode, Dennis Nilsen, and another infamous killer who I covered during the Pierpoint series, John Christie, who was executed when Dennis Nilsen was 8 years old. As children, they both had normal upbringings and were raised in female-dominated households, with Christie being the only boy amongst his female siblings, while Nilsen primarily lived under the care of his mother, aunt and grandmother. While they did not share the same relationship with their grandfathers, it was the sight of the body of this relative at a young age which formed unhealthy views of death. From a young age, Christie and Nilsen both found it difficult to form relationships, struggled with the idea of sex and sexuality, issues that would haunt them throughout their lives with devastating consequences. Both men would seek out roles where order and discipline were paramount by serving in the army and the police force, with them being considered hard-working and fastidious individuals. They attempted to lead a life of normalcy. Christie did get married, and Nilsen did have a long-term relationship, but the loss of these partners negatively impacted them, with their home often reflecting this decline. With regards to their victims, they tended to be individuals who would not be missed or looked for, as both killers took advantage of the social situations of the time. Christie benefited from the unrest of the Second World War and its aftermath, while Nilsen targeted men who were often transient or were unlikely to report an attack because of the stigma surrounding homosexuality. The act of murder allowed these two men to assert their dominance over another individual, giving them a sense of control which was lacking in their day-to-day lives, with both finding the idea of an unconscious or deceased individual arousing. In 1953, Christie's home at 10 Millington Place would be dubbed a House of Horrors, and 3 decades later, the properties Nilsen once called home would be branded with the same moniker. But who was Dennis Nilsen? Join me as I explore his life, crimes, and time behind bars. The fishing port of Fraserburgh stands upon the windswept coast of Scotland, where the North Sea was feared for its ferocity and revered for the bounty it yielded, with the town and surrounding ancient villages taking advantage of the ample supply of herring that filled their nets. It could be a cruel and harsh life, being at the mercy of the sea, as despite the nets being full, it did not guarantee prosperity, with many families living modestly. These hardships could be deepened within an instant, as nearly every household was touched by the loss of someone to the sea, making death an accepted part of existence, creating a steadfast and forthright nature amongst the locals, who turned to religion as a source of comfort and hope. The port of Fraserburgh was the town's lifeblood, yet during the Second World War it would become its biggest liability, as enemy planes sought to destroy major pieces of infrastructure in order to hamper the Allied war effort. The Aberdeenshire coastline was also considered to be vulnerable to the threat of invasion, particularly following the Germans' capture of Norway. This led to the strengthening of the sea defences, with concrete pillboxes being built along the coast, in readiness for the invasion that fortunately never came. But the town would suffer during the German bombardments, with many buildings destroyed and lives lost. As the locals fought to continue to live and work, the town would face an additional challenge, as the pre-war population of approximately 10,000 people would quadruple in the aftermath of the occupation of Norway in April 1940. The town saw an influx of refugees as well as members of the Norwegian army. The arrival of the latter excited many of the young women whose only prospect for marriage before this point had primarily been to local men. Amongst those curious women was Elizabeth White, who was known to everyone as Betty. Just entering her 20s, she was a renowned beauty in the area. Her parents' pride and joy, she was intelligent and fiercely independent. The latter attribute she would demonstrate whenever her father Andrew was away at sea. Defying his strict and pious rules, she would venture out to socialise and dance, sometimes without a chaperone. Yet one night, having just left a local cafe where she had been attending a dance, Betty would be bothered by a soldier, whose advances she rejected, yet the man was persistent in pestering her. Uncomfortable and alone, Betty was adamant in her rejections, and attempted to discourage the man, but he continued to harass her. That was until another soldier stepped in to help. Her rescuer was Dennis Nilsen, a tall, good-looking man who had caught the eye of many of the local girls. But on that night, he only had eyes for Betty, whom he offered to escort home, and following this encounter the pair became inseparable. After a short courtship, they married on the 2nd of May 1942, despite Betty's parents' misgivings. With Olaf still an active serviceman, the couple lived in Betty's parents' home at 47 Academy Road, which Dennis would later describe as, quote, a drab, colourless place, with floral wallpaper and framed religious texts on the wall. It was beneath her parents' roof that Betty would endure her husband's long and frequent absences. And when Olaf was on leave from his duties, he often clashed with Andrew, who disapproved of his son-in-law, particularly because of Olaf's drinking, which was contrary to Andrew's religious sensibilities. Despite the unsuitable living arrangements and animosity the Norwegian received from her parents, Betty and Olaf made the most of his leave, with her 3 children being conceived during their short periods together. Their first child, a son who shared his father's name, would arrive in March 1943, joined by Dennis on the 23rd of November 1945. By the time Dennis arrived, the marriage was already in decline, with Olaf showing more dedication to his army duties than he did to his wife and family, showing no inclination of wanting to settle permanently. Betty was forced to raise her children with the help of her parents and sister Lily, with her and her brood sharing a single room in her parents' house. According to Dennis, both of his parents had been having extramarital affairs, which had cast doubt on the paternity of himself and his younger sister Sylvia. He claimed because he was Betty's husband, Olaf's name was automatically entered on the birth certificate as the father, but Olaf and later Dennis harboured doubts as to whether they were really his children, a suspicion Olaf became certain about upon the birth of Sylvia in 1947, with her allegedly being conceived while Olaf was away. Yet the children's parentage wasn't the only contentious issue. Dennis would reflect that the relationship between his parents was doomed to fail. Built on a foundation of lust, it wavered under the pressure of the war, alongside personality and cultural clashes, with the end of the marriage being made official when Betty and Olaf divorced in 1948, the latter returning to his native Norway, leaving his wife and children behind. For Dennis, however, Olaf Sr. was virtually a stranger, with the Norwegian having spent more time away than he did with his family. The pair had never bonded on a father-son level, with the only thing that kept his father's image fresh in Dennis's mind was a picture from his parents' wedding day. In a primarily female-dominated household, there was one person who Dennis warmed to as the first male adult role model, his grandfather, Andrew White, a man whom the youngster had a deep affection for. A former naval officer who had served on a minesweeper during the First World War, Andrew had traded naval vessels for fishing boats, often spending days, sometimes weeks at sea in order to provide for his family. Of all of the children, Dennis felt these absences the most. As the middle child, he was often overlooked, yet Andrew made him feel special, attending football matches with his grandson, buying him treats and taking the youngster on long walks to the harbour or along the coast, occasionally visiting relatives who lived in the fishing villages on the outskirts of Fraserburgh. They would also regularly walk to an abandoned pillbox on the sand dunes, a now defunct remnant of the war. It provided the pair a sheltered place to sit and drink from Andrew's flask. Not yet 5 years old, these long excursions would prove tiring for the child, and Dennis recalled falling asleep and being carried home in the comforting and strong arms of his loving grandfather. These fond memories would become tainted, however, when Nilsen was older, which I will address shortly. But at the time, his grandfather was his first and sometimes only source of love and attention. The youngster dreaded his grandfather going to sea, and was often distant and sullen during Andrew's absences. One night in October 1951, Dennis and his siblings were in the bedroom, when Betty entered and asked if they would like to see their grandfather. It was less than a month away from his 6th birthday, and little boy did not perceive the depth of the situation, as he was consumed with the excitement of seeing his grandfather, who had returned from a fishing trip. Dennis did not heed the significance of the children being taken into the living room one at a time, nor did he understand why his grandfather was lying in the middle of the room, seemingly in slumber. An image his grandson recalled years later, quote, "Grandad was wearing glasses and expensive long johns. He was barefooted and needed a shave. He looked as if he was sleeping. Indeed, Mrs. Nilsen said that he was just sleeping." In actuality, Andrew White had died of a heart attack while at sea, with his body now lying in situ in the family living room, as was still customary in many households throughout the country. Not fully comprehending the situation, it would cause the infant to form his own thoughts as to what had occurred. When Andrew White disappeared from the home the next day, Dennis believed that he had been taken ill and would return when he was healed. The youngster was told that his grandfather had gone to a better place, which was the catalyst for his distorted view on death, leading him to perceive it as a good thing, while also causing him to struggle with the notion that his beloved relative had gone to a better place and left him behind in a world he increasingly found to be cold and lonely. Dennis had always been a wandering child ever since he was a toddler, yet his grandfather's disappearance from the household only increased his desire to walk alone along the harbour and the sand dunes, much to the annoyance of his mother, who often chastised him for going off without telling anyone. However, these solitary excursions were to Dennis a means of escape, with him seeking out isolated spots, where, over the months, he began to grieve the loss of his grandfather, away from the home where no one seemed to mention Andrew White's name. By 1954, Betty had managed to secure a council flat for herself and her 3 children in the centre of Fraserburgh. The abode, which was located on the top floor of a tenement building, had 2 bedrooms, with Sylvia sharing one with her mother, while Dennis and his older brother Olaf shared a bed in the other room. The siblings would continue to attend Sunday school, with religion having formed a major part of their life while living under their grandparents' roof. But their worship would carry on in a different form upon their move to the new flat. Betty had become associated with a faith mission, and often took Dennis on excursions around Aberdeenshire to help spread the word of God. When not at school, Dennis and Olaf attended the Scottish equivalent to the Cubs, called the Life Boys, and the pair would also go to the picture house on a Saturday, introducing Dennis to his love of film. The youngster also managed to form a small group of friends, but still had a preference towards being alone and partaking in long walks. Having been without the influence of an adult male in his life since the passing of his grandfather, the introduction of a new man into the family was met with apprehension and mistrust by the then 9-year-old Dennis. Adam Scott was a semi-illiterate labourer who worked for the council at Stricken Quarry. He had met Betty at a local fairground and the pair had begun a relationship, one which Dennis later noted saw his mother dominate the passive Scott, who was clearly besotted with her. Initially, Dennis felt animosity towards Adam, the man who was now taking the attention away from the Nilsen siblings, with the 9-year-old feeling that they had become obstacles to their mother's happiness. Yet over time, he would grow to respect the mild-mannered Adam, stating that he was, quote, a good, simple man without malice, guile, or selfish calculation. He was honest and hard-working. Noting that the quiet and reliable man would travel 8 miles a day by bike to get to work, a situation which would change in 1956 when the family moved to a council house at 16 Bard Road, Stricken, which was closer to Adam's place of work, but 7 miles away from Dennis's beloved coastline. That same year, Betty and Adam would be married, and they soon began introducing more children into the family, with them welcoming Violet, Andrew, Gordon and Maurice in the space of 4 years. Although still young, Dennis recognised the impact these new additions would have on an already cash-strapped family. He would also observe that his mother seemed to struggle under the strain of the growing brood, often in witnessing her in tears from exhaustion. The increasing pressure often caused her to lash out at her older children, and they would often hear her cursing their father, Olaf. Dennis acknowledged that his mother was a loving parent, who tried her best and did everything she could, given the circumstances she was under. He also recognised Adam's dedication towards the family, a man whose only vice was smoking, and to help save money he changed from branded cigarettes to a cheaper roll-up alternative, and also took up extra work as a farm labourer. Dennis was also aware that his mother was lucky to have such a man, who alongside being family-focused was never drunk or violent. During his pre-teens, Dennis started to notice that he was different from others. He began to recognise a disparity between the working-class families and those of the middle classes. He often witnessed the upper classes on the golf courses, and noted that they could afford things like holidays and other luxuries which were denied to a poor family like his. For some reason, this led him to concoct the idea that social standing was dictated by character and behaviour. People were wealthy because they behaved well, whereas people were poor because they did not. Having already recognised that there was a difference between the classes, Dennis would also encounter another situation which made him feel disconnected from others, including his own family. They would often visit Adam's relatives, yet these trips came to an end upon the receipt of the invitation to Adam's stepsister's wedding. The whole family had been invited, except for Sylvia and Dennis, with the stepsister alluding to their illegitimacy as the reason given for their exclusion, alleging that the pair had been born out of wedlock. This was possibly the first time Dennis was truly aware of his dubious parentage, and he would begin to take note of comments people made, including his own mother, who once told him he would not know his father if he passed him in the street, which made Dennis consider that his biological father may still live in the area. On another occasion, Betty would suggest that her son's father was actually a police officer. But these uncertainties regarding his parentage may have exacerbated his growing resentment towards his brother Olaf. Perceiving that his older sibling was the golden child, he noted that his mother had numerous photos of Olaf, while only one existed of Dennis that had been taken by his Aunt Lily when he was about 5 years old. However, Betty would later disclose that she found it hard to show him love, with Dennis seeming to repel any forms of tactile affection. Meanwhile, her son interpreted it as his mother being, quote, emotional ice. In contrast, Olaf was an affectionate and attentive son, and Dennis would look upon him with increasing jealousy, seeing that not only did Olaf receive the most attention, but he was attractive, athletic, and academically gifted. Dennis suspected that his family believed Olaf was destined for greatness, while he would falter and be stuck with no prospects in Stricken. His feelings of inadequacy only grew as he got older, particularly when he became ill and was forced to give up his paper round and delivery jobs, which he did before and after school to help bring in some extra money for the family. Due to the family's financial situation, Dennis would often go without a decent meal, and the lack of food combined with him walking the streets during his deliveries in all weathers led to him becoming increasingly lethargic. At first it affected his ability to concentrate at school, causing him to fall behind in his work. Occasionally he fell asleep, for which he would be reprimanded. Yet with Dennis's immune system weakened, his condition became serious when he collapsed and was rushed to hospital, where he was diagnosed with pleurisy and pneumonia, prompting a prolonged stay in Aberdeen Hospital. The implication of his illness led to him not only falling further behind in his schooling, but also caused Dennis to give up his delivery jobs, limiting his contributions to the household. Yet his behaviour was also beginning to be a source of contention, with Dennis continuing to disappear for hours at a time, much to the consternation of his mother, who threatened that if he continued to act in such a manner, he could be taken into care. But her warnings seemingly went unheeded, with Dennis continuing to toe the line of right and wrong. On one occasion, he stole money from his mother's purse in order to purchase tickets to see the film Dambusters. Dennis's enjoyment of the screening was interrupted when his stepfather dragged him from the cinema and beat him upon their return home. This was an action which Dennis recalled Adam was often goaded into doing by Betty, who insisted that it was Adam's duty as the man of the house to physically chastise the children. On another occasion, Dennis and some friends were reprimanded by police after they were caught breaking into an old iron drifter boat in the harbour. But for the most part, Dennis's main issue was his constant need to disappear and wander alone across the open countryside, sometimes getting home after dark, where his ever exasperated mother would be waiting for his return. His long treks, particularly along the seashore, were the times during which he felt close to his grandfather, whose presence Dennis still missed, and an incident involving an elderly man in Stricken would serve to awaken memories of his beloved relative's death. Reports had spread throughout the village that an elderly man called Mr. Ironside had disappeared from his home, and the community turned out to help search for him. Amongst them was Dennis and a friend, with the pair opting to walk along the banks of the river Uge, which flowed close to their school. The two boys would be the ones to spot the body of Mr. Ironside floating in the water. Still dressed in his pyjamas, it appeared as though the old man, in a confused state, had left his home during the night and fallen into the river. The sight of the body reminded Dennis of his grandfather, but he would recall the incident for another reason, as he remembered how he was attracted to the sight of his classmate in just shorts and plimsolls, balancing on a tree branch in an attempt to get close enough to identify whether it was actually a body in the water. The sight of the scantily clad boy aroused feelings in Dennis, which he would experience on numerous occasions, but was too afraid to act upon or speak about, as he had been taught that these feelings were morally wrong in accordance with the piety of his religious upbringing. As he got older, he became aware that he was attracted to other males, with notable incidents including an obsession he developed regarding another boy at his school, who Dennis described as beautiful, frequently watching his obsession but never having the courage to interact with him. He found himself drawn to a black and white image of a boy in a French textbook, who, like his friend walking along the tree branch, was attired in shorts, and Dennis was fascinated by the pearly white skin on the boy's legs. Throughout his pre- and early teens, Dennis remained uneasy regarding his sexuality, and did not have any consensual sexual interactions. He would recall later in life that older boys would target younger ones by pushing them to the ground, pulling their pants down, and fondling their genitalia, actions he would replicate himself on other boys. Dennis also learned about masturbation through his peers, when he and a group of friends took shelter during a rainstorm. While waiting for the weather to improve, one friend began to demonstrate how to masturbate. This prompted Dennis to try it in the privacy of his family bathroom later that day. Struggling to come to terms with his attraction towards the same sex, he tried to explore his sexuality, but unable to express it openly, he chose someone who was asleep, his brother Olaf, whom he shared a bed with. On a night, Dennis would wait for his sibling to fall asleep and began to explore his body, building up to the point where he rolled down the waistband of his brother's pyjama bottoms, exposing the genitals, which Dennis fondled until it became erect. These nightly explorations came to an end when on one occasion Olaf woke up, and although nothing was ever said between them regarding this incident, Dennis believed that this was the point at which Olaf knew about his sexuality. Yet Olaf was not the only sibling Dennis was inappropriate with, as he would also carry out a similar assault on his sister Sylvia, an action he claimed was his attempt to determine whether he may have actually been bisexual. Some of Dennis's early sexual encounters have been called into question regarding how much of them bordered on fantasy, with him admitting to a psychiatrist that he had a tendency to embellish his memories. One such recollection pertains to the memory he had regarding a visit to an isolated beach while still contending with the loss of his grandfather. Dennis claimed that in a daze he walked into the sea until he got out of his depth. As he was dragged under the waves, the current pulled him further away from the shore, with him struggling to keep his head above the surface. He hoped his grandfather would save him, yet Dennis recalls disappearing beneath the water and being overcome with a feeling of peace. He claimed he awoke on the beach later, discovering his clothes had been removed and laid out on the sand nearby. And as he came to, he became aware of a sticky substance on his chest, and had a vague recollection of a boy rescuing him from the water, and that the individual had seemingly pleasured himself during the experience. While it has been stated that there may have been some truth to this memory, the inclusion of the rescuer and their actions has been called into question, particularly as aspects of this incident would be echoed in how he treated those he murdered, with him placing the deceased in a bathtub to wash them and becoming excited by their naked, incapacitated form. Like with many of Nilsen's recollections, it is hard to know whether the beach rescue was just a fantasy concocted in his mind, or perhaps Dennis was drawing from earlier experiences where he had witnessed a lifeguard rescuing a boy from the sea, and had subsequently imagined a version of the incident in which he was the individual in need of saving. Regardless of his fantasies, one thing is certain: Dennis had developed an affinity with the water from an early age. It was a symbol of life and death, his connection to his grandfather, and would play a role in the fate of some of his future victims. The shadow of his grandfather continued to haunt Dennis, and while in prison, he produced hundreds of hours of audio tapes and wrote thousands of pages of notes, which would eventually form his autobiography, History of a Drowning Boy. Within these recordings, he alleged that his grandfather was not the pious, well-respected and loving man he was perceived to be by his community, but had actually been abusing Dennis, with the latter looking back on his experience, claiming that, quote, "It is a most horrifying admission to make, that the only tactile contact I had in my early formative years was the painful and confusing paradoxical embrace of a paedophile." Yet some have called into question these allegations, including Michael Hart, who directed the Netflix series Memories of a Murderer, The Nilsen Tapes. The director told Newsweek that during the process of researching for the show, he began to form an impression of the serial killer, with Michael stating, quote, "It became clear pretty early in the process that what we had here was an unreliable narrator. He's lying to himself, creating an image because he does not want to take responsibility for what he did, and I wanted to explore that. Going on to address Nilsen's childhood recollections, the director continued by pointing out, "There are huge question marks over his childhood. I was very careful about how we shot those scenes. I wanted to make sure it didn't feel too real. This is Nilsen's version of what happened. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But for me, it was clear that I knew that I couldn't present this as the truth, because for me, it didn't seem to be the case." It will never be truly known whether Nilsen's childhood memories had been tainted by later embellishments, or whether he had been the victim of his grandfather's perverse actions, due to both parties now being deceased and there being no evidence to prove or disprove the allegations. According to his own admissions, Nilsen's childhood had been shaped by his feelings of being different and perceiving that he did not belong. Yet Michael Hart believed this was also partially concocted, with the director noting that the serial killer, quote, would describe himself or picture himself very much as an outsider, as someone living on the fringes of society due to various factors like his sexuality, economic status, and his family. I mean, he talks about it a lot. He would pity himself almost like a victim of society. But then I realised what was happening was the way he was painting himself. He was describing some of his victims who were on the fringes of society. End quote. This perception of feeling like an outsider would change as Dennis approached the end of his schooling. Having spent hours watching the trains leaving Fraserburgh Station and passing by his school, Dennis began to see those tracks as his escape route, and in 1961 he enlisted in the army. At just 15 years old, Dennis Nilsen bid farewell to his stepfather, Adam, at Fraserburgh Station, and boarded the train bound for Aberdeen. From there he would head roughly 550 miles south to Aldershot, where he would commence his training to become an army chef. He was billeted alongside 11 other boys between the ages of 15 to 18, with whom he would reside for the next 3 years. Dennis found a place where he was accepted for his intelligence and humour. Later, describing his 11 years in the army as some of the best days of his life, he embraced the regimentation and camaraderie, but he was also forced to stifle his natural attraction to other men. He adopted to taking private baths, rather than using the communal showers in case his body betrayed his desires. And when his fellow servicemen would be derogatory about homosexuality, Dennis felt compelled to join in or agree, presenting a front to avoid shame, judgment or prejudice, particularly because at that time male homosexuality was considered a criminal offence. It was 6 years after he joined the army that the Sexual Offence Act of 1967 would be introduced in England, which decriminalised private sex acts between consenting men over the age of 21, whereas Scotland and Ireland would not amend their laws until 1980 and 1982 respectively. With his sexuality challenging his law-abiding nature and his religious upbringing, Dennis learned how to present as straight, and as he had done during school, he continued to admire other males from a distance, becoming thrilled at the glimpse of a companion's genitals, but never acting on his desires. To relieve himself sexually, he would masturbate in the privacy of a toilet cubicle, imagining that the body he was touching was not his own, often recalling the image of his brother as one of the only people he had explored sexually. There were individuals amongst the cadets that caught his eye, including a boy called Brian, whom Dennis recalled was a small, effeminate boy, characteristics shared with most of his victims. Chris would be another companion who caught Dennis's attention during a camping trip which involved the boys sleeping in pairs. Within the small space of a two-person tent, Dennis caught a glimpse of Chris's genitalia as he undressed before slipping into the sleeping bag beside Dennis. Aroused by the circumstances, he later described the feeling of intimacy with his oblivious companion, recalling, quote, "In that moment he was the purest being on the planet." Aside from his brother Olaf, Chris would also form part of Dennis's many fantasies, with the teenager imagining lying naked beside his companion. These made-up scenarios proved to be his only means of expressing his true feelings in an environment where those who were perceived to be gay were ostracised and treated with disdain. In the summer of 1964, Dennis would be one of the only cadets not to have loved ones there to witness his passing out parade, and after a brief return to Stricken, he was deployed to Osnabrück in Germany. Here he would acquire his taste for drink, with his fellow officers working hard and drinking hard, often having to carry or be carried to bed if they had consumed too much alcohol. The sensation of being carried in a semi-conscious state would also become incorporated into Nilsen's evolving fantasies, with him often feigning unconsciousness in order to play the passive role as he felt the tactile sensation of another man carrying him. While stationed at Osnabrück, the barracks became embroiled in a murder investigation, with police suspecting that the individual who had shot and killed a local taxi driver, called Felix Rees, had been stationed at the base. The perpetrator would soon be identified as a 19-year-old officer who would admit to killing the taxi driver during an attempted robbery, with him claiming that he was unaware that the gun he was using had been loaded and it had gone off accidentally during a struggle. In April 1967, the 19-year-old soldier was convicted of murder at a court-martial held in Germany and was sentenced to life in prison. He would only serve 10 years, and upon his release, the convicted murderer, Leslie Grantham, would become a household name, playing the role of Den Watts in EastEnders. 3 months prior to Grantham's sentencing, Dennis was relocated to the barracks connected to the Al-Mansura prison in Aden, with it being the first time the 21-year-old had been situated within a hostile environment, as the area experienced unrest since Britain's occupation of the region in 1939. Due to the high risk, movements outside the base were strictly regulated, with checkpoints and armoured vehicles a common sight. Yet soldiers, including Dennis, would leave the base in order to go drinking, with it being claimed in Brian Master's book, Killing for Company, that some of them were killed, even at the hands of sex workers who would offer their services only to then slit the soldier's throat. Even the taxi drivers could pose a risk, with officers being urged to only use army transportation. However, one night, Dennis, who had headed outside of the protected zone to go drinking, missed the armoured vehicle that would have taken him back to base. Aware of the risks, in a drunken state he began walking, thumbing for a lift from passing vehicles until a taxi pulled up beside him, and without hesitation, Dennis climbed into the back seat. Once the vehicle had been waved through the security checkpoint, Dennis noticed that the driver had taken a detour. Pulling up in a desolate spot, the man claimed he was experiencing engine trouble. But before Dennis could react, everything went black. He woke up, naked, in a dark, cramped place, with it taking him a moment to register that he was in the boot of the vehicle, which was moving once more. When it came to a halt, Dennis, fearful of what might happen next, fumbled around in the darkness, grabbed hold of something cold and metallic, and he feigned unconsciousness as the boot lid was lifted. Dennis alleges that the driver proceeded to caress his legs. Running his hands up the inside of his thigh, he lifted the limb before releasing it, with Dennis allowing it to fall limply to maintain his passive appearance. Yet as soon as the driver bent over to lift him out of the vehicle, Dennis swiftly swung the metal item in his hand, striking the man over the head, knocking him to the ground, where Dennis repeated the blows several times until the man lay bloodied and motionless. Although they were in a seemingly isolated location, the 21-year-old felt he needed to act quickly to prevent his crime being discovered. As such, he placed the man into the boot of the car and proceeded to kick the bloodstained sand until all visible traces of the attack were hidden. Returning to the base on foot, Dennis would make no mention of the incident. Accepting his reprimand for being late, he blamed it on missing the armoured transport. Over the next few days he waited nervously for news regarding the taxi driver's fate, but no reports of a body or the attack were ever made, with Dennis wondering whether the man had survived but didn't tell the police in order to cover up his own misdemeanours. this is an incident which cannot be verified, and thus it is hard to determine how much of the account is factual and how much was born from Nilsen's imagination, with it being stated in Killing for Company that, quote, he is prone to embellish memories with imagined details and is no longer certain which of his recollections are fantasy and which are fact. The psychiatrists who examined Dennis around the time of his trial put forward their belief that this incident was most likely a fantasy. Despite this assessment, Dennis would allege that for months after the incident he was haunted by nightmares, which revolved around the question regarding what his fate would have been had the man been able to carry out whatever he had planned. He would dream about being raped, tortured and murdered by the man. Yet these nightmares would also see the taxi driver morph into the image of his grandfather, with the elderly man suffocating him, causing Dennis to soil himself only to be chastised for it. Each experience enhanced his fantasies, with each new addition contributing towards his actions as a serial killer. He learned he liked the idea of a passive subject, and imagined himself in the dual roles of an old man, the abuser, and the young boy being his victim. His fantasies would evolve once more upon the death of a companion on the base, who had fallen from a moving vehicle and died. The body of this man was buried on the sand close to the barracks, with his passing inciting Dennis to ponder the realities of death and how, in dying, the young soldier would remain the same age, a vision of youth forever. Leaving the hostile environment of Aden, Dennis would be stationed for a short time on the Persian Gulf, where he was afforded the luxury of a private room. Here he would experience his first sexual interactions with a boy who worked as a servant, but also offered sexual favours. In his autobiography, History of a Draining Boy, published in 2021, Dennis detailed his interactions with this individual, seemingly having no shame regarding their sexual encounters. To Brian Masters, who compiled Killing for Company, published in 1985, using Dennis's own notations, the serial killer claimed he felt ashamed using the boy whose age was unknown. These encounters were only possible, however, due to Dennis having a private space in which he could explore his sexuality, and aside from the servant boy, he was able to add another piece to his complex fantasy world. Within the room was a full-length mirror, which Dennis positioned so that he could view his naked form upon the bed, ensuring that his head was out of view. He was able to imagine that he was not the person on the bed whose body he explored and caressed. This role-play evolved with him covering his skin in talc to give it the pale appearance he found himself increasingly drawn to. In History of a Draining Boy, Dennis explained this aspect of his fantasies, claiming he found he was attracted to a passive and helpless form, and to achieve this he deemed, quote, that the most passive opposite from the real living me was the dead helpless me. In his imagination, the young helpless boy on the bed was dominated by its polar opposite, an older man, with Dennis stating it would always be that filthy, drooling, ugly old man. He would also imagine his own deceased body had been disinterred from the ground by the old man, who would carry it to a room where he would be undressed, washed and touched. For now these remained fantasies held within the confines of his mind, but each added a piece of the puzzle, contributing to what he would later refer to as his ritual. After a number of brief postings, Dennis would return to Germany, where he began to physically explore his sexuality. On one occasion he woke up to find another man beside him, but his recollections of what had occurred between them were vague or non-existent, with him claiming he garnered no satisfaction from the encounter. He still struggled to accept that he was gay, pondering the possibility he may be bisexual. He paid for a sex worker, and although he climaxed, Dennis would later claim that the experience was underrated and depressing. It was while returning home from Berlin that Dennis would carry out one of his earliest non-consensual sex acts on an adult, when he took advantage of a soldier who had fallen ill on the train. Dennis escorted the individual to the toilet, where the man who had consumed excessive amounts of alcohol blacked out in the privacy of the cubicle, leaving him at the mercy of Dennis, who proceeded to kiss the unconscious man before removing the soldier's trousers and sexually assaulting him, although he did not penetrate his victim. But this was only because he was deterred by other passengers hammering on the toilet door. Panicked, Dennis redressed the unconscious man, whom he carried back to their seat, with the man awaking seemingly unaware that anything had occurred. It was during his last posting on the Shetland Islands where Dennis's tendency to become infatuated with an individual became apparent. He formed a relationship with an 18-year-old officer, a young homesick boy with whom he would share long walks and his love of films. Dennis admitted that he, quote, loved him so much that it was a source of extreme pain to me when he was not around or when he would go off anywhere without me. Acquiring a camera, Dennis would often film his young companion, using these clips to masturbate to in private. Yet the closest the pair came to physical intimacy occurred one night when Dennis discovered the youngster sat upset and alone in a bar. Initially, he attempted to comfort the youth while maintaining his straight-presenting persona. But as he escorted the teenager back to the barracks, he propositioned him, only for the boy to reject his advances. This was the beginning of the end of their friendship, with the teenager keeping his distance from Dennis, while the latter became increasingly infuriated when he saw the boy in the presence of a sergeant, whom Dennis believed showed the teenager special attention. His feelings for the teenager led to two confrontations, the first between Dennis and the sergeant, with the former demanding to know what the man's intentions were, only to be told that the 18-year-old was old enough to make his own choices regarding how and with whom he spent his time. The second altercation was between Dennis and the teenager, which escalated into a physical fight, although when the boy wrestled him to the floor and began to throttle the man, who was almost 10 years his senior, Dennis did not retaliate, even as he struggled for breath. With the decline of this relationship, which was built on unrequited feelings, Dennis considered throwing himself off Fitful Head into the cold embrace of the water below. Although he resisted this moment of despair, his time in the army was coming to a close, and he would destroy many of the memories he had formed during his last posting on the Shetland Islands, burning film reels and documents, effectively destroying all traces of a love that never was. Having been in the army for 11 years and 84 days, with a record of exemplary service, Dennis decided it was time for a change, but uncertain what course to choose, he briefly returned home to Stricken. His sister Sylvia had married and moved to Canada, where she had started her own family, while his brother Olaf still resided in the town and had also gotten married. With two of her children now married and starting families, Betty hoped that Dennis would follow suit, yet to her disappointment he did not seem to have any desire to do so. Dennis believed there was only one individual in Stricken who knew the reason for his reluctance, his brother Olaf, and one night while watching a film at his siblings' home, accompanied by his sister-in-law and another couple, Olaf would make his feelings regarding Dennis's sexuality clear. The film, titled Victim, told the story of a married man who was having a homosexual relationship for which he and his extramarital partner was being blackmailed. It delves into many of the issues faced by gay men during the 1960s, and according to Robin Griffiths, the author of Queer Cinema in Europe, it was, quote, the first British film to explicitly name homosexuality and deal with it sympathetically. Yet the sympathetic tone of the film was not reflected in the home of Olaf Nilsen, who spoke in a derogatory manner regarding the subject matter, making Dennis feel increasingly uncomfortable, with the tension reaching boiling point when the group headed to the pub where Olaf and Dennis argued. Returning home, Dennis refused to enter his mother's property, opting instead to lock himself in the garden shed. Betty's hopes that Dennis would find a wife and settle down were dashed when Olaf informed her of his suspicion that Dennis was actually gay. This would result in the brothers' relationship breaking down completely, with Dennis leaving stricken and having no further contact with his sibling, whom growing up he had resented and abused. Dennis would only return to Stricken one more time during Christmas of 1972. While there, he received a letter from the 18-year-old soldier who he had been infatuated with while on the Shetland Islands, with the correspondence informing him that the youth had recently married, a union Dennis believed was a facade to cover the boy's true sexuality. It would be the last time Dennis saw his hometown, a place he never felt he belonged. He hoped that in London he would find what he was missing. Having considered his options, he decided against pursuing a career as a prison guard, opting instead to train as a police officer, with Dennis believing in the moral and dutiful role an officer of the law fulfilled. But this belief was eroded during his brief time in the force. As with the army, Dennis would be provided accommodation while attending the police training college in Hendon. Here he enjoyed the same camaraderie he had experienced in the army. He would also get a glimpse into the corruption that existed at the time within the police force, and became aware of the attitudes towards people from different backgrounds, ethnicities, and sexualities. Dennis regularly went out for drinks with his fellow cadets, and one night they headed to a strip club where they were granted free entry when one of the cadets flashed his police identity card. But this would just be the tip of the iceberg when it came to the liberties Dennis alleged some officers took. Upon completing his training, Dennis was housed in property for unmarried officers while stationed at Willesden Green, with one of his first experiences being a visit to the mortuary where he and another rookie were shown the bodies of 3 deceased individuals, 2 elderly men and a little girl. Having seen the bodies of soldiers while in the army, the sight did not disturb Dennis. But one moment in particular lingered in his mind. It was a simple action during which the attendant lifted the wrist of the girl and released it, the pale hand dropping and brushing momentarily against the pallid thigh of the elderly man beside her. This brief moment excited Dennis, as it invoked his old man and young boy fantasies. Another aspect of the role which played into his sexuality and fantasies came through his training. Nilsen would not only learn about police procedures while on the force, garnering experience conducting arrests and having to testify in court, but he would also learn what areas the gay community tended to frequent. He would also learn, while stationed at Willesden Green, that the camaraderie he had enjoyed in the army and during his police training dissipated, with officers at the station having their own homes and lives outside of work. Dennis began to feel the effects of being alone in a big city. However, he had learned where the gay hotspots were, so he began to visit the bars and clubs in these parts of London. One of his first encounters occurred just a week after this information had been divulged to the trainees at the police college, with Dennis taking the tube to Earl's Court and wandering into a bar. At first he felt uncomfortable, but consuming several drinks he became acquainted with a slim, good-looking man, and with his inhibitions lowered the pair headed off to the stranger's home. But when they got there, they were greeted by a very angry woman with a child, and during the ensuing argument Dennis discerned that the man he had met was actually their husband and father, and it had evidently not been the first time he had attempted to bring another man home. The wife ordered Dennis to leave, yet to his surprise the man stated that if she made his companion leave, he would go also, to which she agreed, and in the early hours of the morning both men were cast out onto the street. With nowhere else to go, Dennis invited the man back to the training centre, with the pair sneaking into the accommodation block via the fire exit, and once inside his room, they undressed and climbed into bed, but both fell asleep before any sexual activity occurred. Awaking to find his companion still sleeping beside him, Dennis would treat the passive man's body in the same manner he had acted towards his brother during his pubescent years. As morning broke, the man slipped out of the building by the fire escape to never be seen by Dennis again, which would be the case for many of his casual interactions over the years. Another man he would bring back to the section house, where he resided while being stationed at Willesden Green as an unmarried officer, was Paul Waring, a youthful-looking individual in his early 20s, whom Dennis described as being, quote, smooth, pale and slim, with long silver fair hair, and he reminded me of my sister Sylvia. The pair met at the King William IV pub in Hampstead, before heading to the section house where they were intimate. Once again Dennis walked before his guest, and in the dim light he gazed upon the sleeping man and began to wish that they could form a lasting relationship. Paul would wake to find Dennis fully dressed in his police uniform, ready to start his shift, and unlike his previous encounters, the pair left the section house via the front door, with Dennis explaining his companion's presence by stating to the sergeant that Paul had purchased the fish tank he had for sale. Accompanying Paul to the nearby train station, Dennis was both surprised and excited when the man kissed his cheek on the platform. But Dennis's hopes that that lingering kiss would develop into a blossoming relationship never came to fruition. Although they did meet up again on several occasions, Paul was a free spirit, looking for casual affairs, not commitment. The pair's interactions would end in 1974, when Dennis learned that he had contracted an STD from Paul, following which he cut all contact. While beginning to feel that his personal life was doomed to be relegated to a series of casual and meaningless affairs, Dennis was also starting to lose his idealized view of the police, as he bore witness to the unethical practices carried out, particularly by the CID officers, who he claimed used coercion, blackmail, evidence planting and violence, with Dennis being encouraged to turn a blind eye. Years later, Dennis claimed that the corruption and violence he witnessed enacted out on those in custody was what drove him to be compliant and forthcoming when it came to his own arrest, with him believing that as a homosexual serial killer, he would be a prime target for the violence he had seen given out to individuals who were being held for lesser crimes. It was also his knowledge of this harsh treatment which he claimed not only caused him to confess, but it also made him concerned for his life, to the extent that he had written a letter addressed to his solicitor which he had placed in his desk drawer at work. In the correspondence he stated that should his death occur in custody, it should be viewed with suspicion, as he was in good health and not suicidal. While still in the force, however, he had started to see that, quote, the police and the villains began to look very much the same. He also alleged that in order to move up the ranks, officers were prepared to do anything. Having joined the police believing he would be serving the public and upholding the law, Dennis's glimpse into the seedy underbelly of the Metropolitan Police made him question his decision. He had also begun to struggle to reconcile what he did in private and what was expected of him as an officer. This was exemplified one night while he was out on patrol and encountered two men having sex on the back seat of a car. The expectation on him as an officer would have been to arrest the pair for gross indecency in a public place. Yet Dennis decided to give them a warning and did not make a record of the incident. This encounter, combined with everything he had experienced and his inability to reconcile his private and professional life, would be issues he reflected upon in the history of a drowning boy, in which he stated, it became clearly apparent that I couldn't reconcile my expanding gay lifestyle and aspirations while remaining a Metropolitan Police officer. I couldn't be open about my homosexuality, and if I wanted to gain promotion, I would have to adopt all the practices I detested. Therefore, in December 1973, Dennis handed in his resignation, citing poor pay and work stress as his reasons for wanting to leave. Throughout his 28 years of life, Dennis had his basic needs covered, either by his family or through the army and police. Yet as Christmas 1973 approached, he would have to find his own place. But within that came a release from the restrictions he had been living under. He rented a one-bedroom flat at number 9 Manston Road in Cricklewood, and began working as a security guard, a role he found tedious, but conceded that it paid the bills. But he would not remain in his new home for long, as by the summer of 1974 he had moved out of the flat after the landlady took exception to him entertaining men in his room. After 6 months of being a security guard, the boring nature of the role could no longer be compensated by the pay he was receiving. Unemployed and living in new accommodations at 80 Tamworth Road, Cricklewood, Dennis slumped into a stage of drinking in bars, casual encounters, and lonely nights with just a bottle and his music for company. Without money, this lifestyle was not sustainable, with him resorting to selling his Army Service Medal to pay the rent. Dennis accepted that he would have to resort to claiming benefits, and so headed to the job centre. Yet instead of being signed up for government assistance, he was put forward for a role at the job centre, working at the Denmark Street branch, which specialised in supplying catering and domestic staff for the local hospitality industry. Outside of work, Dennis continued his life of promiscuity and casual relationships, but was becoming increasingly aware that, quote, anonymous sex only deepens one's sense of loneliness. Hoping for a committed relationship, he believed he had found someone who could make his dream a reality, David Gallishan, whom he had encountered after intervening when he witnessed the 20-year-old being harassed by 2 men outside a pub. Living in a hostel, David, a blonde-haired, earring-wearing individual who had a transient life, willingly accepted Dennis's invite back to the room at Tamworth Road. By the following morning, the pair had decided to start a relationship. Meeting David coincided with Dennis receiving the news that his father had passed away. Since leaving Betty and their 3 children in Stricken, Olaf Nilsen had gone on to remarry 3 more times, with Dennis learning he had half-siblings from these unions. He also discovered that his father's surname was not actually Nilsen, but Maxime, which he claimed affected his sense of identity. Olaf's estate would be shared between his children, including Dennis, who inherited £1,000, which is the equivalent of $7,600 in today's money. With this money, Dennis would acquire the ground floor flat at 195 Melrose Avenue, a place he hoped he and David would live their lives happily together. Settling into their new accommodation, the pair set about making the flat a home. After purchasing furniture for the inside, they turned their attention to the overgrown communal gardens to the rear, which they were able to reach from a set of patio doors, while the other residents gained access via a passageway at the side of the house. It appeared as though the neglected space had not been used in a long time, and through their own hard work and money, David and Dennis transformed the wasteland into a usable garden. It was only after they had completed the task that the other tenants, who had not assisted in the transformation, now wished to use the garden. Dennis cited that his fellow tenants' neglect of the space and the efforts he and David had put into reclaiming it as reasons why they should have sole access to the garden, a request which was granted, allowing the pair to have a private sanctuary. The couple would welcome a new member to the family, acquiring a black and white puppy from a nearby pet shop, which David carried home inside his zipped-up jacket. Hearing the noise of the little dog whimpering beneath the coat, Dennis would name her Bleep, and though she began as his and David's dog, he would view her as his only loyal companion. During their 2-year relationship, there was a clear difference between the pair. While they both worked, Dennis spent his earnings on bills and preferred to stay home watching films, listening to music, and spending time with David and Bleep, clinging on to an image of domesticity which was not actually there. David, who Dennis nicknamed as Twinkle, allegedly because he was often distant and uninteresting, also worked, but tended to spend his money on the pubs and clubs. Dennis claimed he was irresponsible and frivolous, and while Dennis wanted commitment, David would go out and hook up with other men, sometimes spending a number of days with his latest conquest before returning to the flat on Melrose Avenue, where he and Dennis had separate beds and had infrequent sexual interactions. The gulf between them continued to grow, and in April 1976, Dennis became increasingly irritable as he struggled with abdominal pains, with David bearing the brunt of his irritation over the 2 months leading up to Dennis's surgery on his gallbladder. After the operation, he would be in hospital for almost 2 weeks, but David only visited him after a phone call requesting him to do so. Upon his return home, the relationship between the pair had transformed from being a couple to that of flatmates, with them doing their own thing and bringing home other partners. This would cause problems of its own, when one night David brought home a 17-year-old boy, but after watching a film and drinking with Dennis and his guest, David left them and headed to bed. That night the boy, according to Dennis, became ill from consuming too much alcohol, and he nursed him overnight. In the morning he informed the teenager that he had to go to work, but told him that David would take care of him. However, in a clear sign that communication had broken down between the couple, David also left the flat, leaving the teenager alone. When they returned from work, the electric and gas meter had been emptied of money, and the teenage boy was gone. As David spent more time away from the flat, Dennis began to seek out his own casual partners to bring back in David's absence. Yet one encounter almost ended up with criminal charges. Dennis tended to keep his private and professional life separate, with him rarely socialising with his colleagues outside of office hours. Yet it was through his work he would meet Daniel Painter. The experience itself indicated to Dennis how male-on-male crimes were perceived by the police and the public. Daniel Painter was a 17-year-old runaway who had come to the job centre in search of work. However, when Dennis finished his shift that night, he encountered the teenager again, and after conversing for a while, the pair headed back to Dennis's flat, where they watched a film. Painter would reject Dennis's sexual advances and retired to bed alone, only to wake up to find his host standing over him, wielding a camera, according to Killing for Company, while History of a Drowning Boy alleges that the 17-year-old was woken when Dennis tried to cuddle up to him while they were asleep in bed together. Whatever had woken Daniel threw the youngster into a panic state, and according to Dennis, the youth became hysterical, screaming and destroying the room before running through the living room window. Dennis called the emergency services, with one of the responding officers being Detective Sergeant Brenton, who recalled the incident on the Netflix documentary Memories of a Murderer, the Nilsen tapes. D.S. Benton arrived at the property and was first drawn to the room being painted black, but his attention was quickly redirected to the chaos in the room, with blood and broken glass all over the floor. Dennis was taken to the police station for questioning, whilst Daniel, a pale, skinny waif of a kid according to D.S. Benton, was escorted to hospital where he required 100 stitches. Having received treatment, the youngster was questioned, with the officer recounting the boy's statement during the Netflix documentary, stating, quote, "He'd been picked up in a pub by a man with a dour Scots voice and was taken back to the flat, plied with alcohol. Then he woke up and discovered he was naked and this man was coming towards him. So, fight or flight, he hurled himself through the window." While Daniel was in the hospital, Dennis would be held in the cells at the local police station as investigations into the incident were carried out. When he was asked why Daniel had recklessly thrown himself through a pane of glass, Dennis, in a self-assured manner, replied, "Well, I don't know why he did it, but if you've got the evidence, you charge me, but if you don't, you let me go." Checks determined that Daniel had been reported missing by his parents, who were contacted and joined their son at his hospital bedside. But when it came to the question of whether they wanted to press charges against Dennis, the parents had to consider a number of factors. First, their son had apparently not been harmed or molested, although the details of what had occurred were ambiguous, as it was Daniel's word against Dennis's. They also considered that their son was just 17 years old, meaning he was under the age of consent. He may also be prosecuted, as the law at the time only permitted sexual activities between 2 consenting gay men in a private space over the age of 21. But ultimately, Dennis and D.S. Brenton both seeming to agree that the main reason they believe the parents did not press charges was through shame. D.S. Brenton recalled that he tried to get the parents to reconsider, urging them if Dennis didn't face the consequences, he would likely do it again to someone else. But they were insistent, with the officer stating they just wanted to take him home and forget that it had all happened. Dennis also reflected on whether their decision was also driven by the fear of the stigma that their son may encounter should the case be brought before the court and into the public arena, with them fearing that people would assume their child was gay. This would not be the only time police would be called to Dennis's flat, but each time he would face no consequences and would live up to the note D.S. Brenton wrote on his intelligence card regarding the incident, in which he stated, "In my opinion, this man is a dangerous psychopath." The officer also lamented how many lives may have been saved had Dennis been prosecuted for the incident, with him telling the Netflix documentary, "I always think about what if they'd said, 'We'll prosecute him,' who would still be breathing today?" As Dennis's offending seemed to be escalating, his relationship with David was on the decline, with the latter recalling that although Dennis was never violent towards him, he could become verbally aggressive, which intensified as their relationship broke down. The final straw came when Bleep had produced a litter of puppies, which required close supervision when the door to the garden was open, due to the fact there was a pond they could fall into. Dennis had gone to the shops, and upon returning, he could hear Bleep crying and yelping. Racing outside, he found 3 of the puppies in the water, with him only able to revive one of them. Heading back inside, he found David sat in front of the television, having seemingly ignored what Dennis called Bleep's cries for help. Angered by David's lack of concern or care, Dennis shouted at him and told him to leave. David, however, would claim that he chose to leave, with Brian Masters suggesting that perhaps Dennis portrayed it differently because David, being the one making the decision, robbed him of his dominance and feeling of superiority. Despite how it ended, the relationship with David was the longest Dennis would have. He would lose contact with his former lover, only learning of David's death in 1992 through a newspaper article. After David left, Dennis's other relationships were short, with the longest being just 4 months, which ended after his new partner was unfaithful. With his love life reduced once again to fleeting encounters, Dennis focused on 2 things, his work and Bleep, both being the only constant aspects of his life up until his arrest. Dennis would spend Christmas of 1978 alone in his flat drinking, with only his beloved dog Bleep for company. 4 days later, as the new year approached, he headed out in hopes of expelling his loneliness. Wandering into the Cricklewood Arms, he would sit at the bar consuming several pints, and get into a conversation with an Irish boy whom he would take back to Melrose Avenue, changing the course of both their lives forever. Thank you for joining me for this first instalment of the Dennis Nilsen episodes. Join me next time as I delve into the murders at Melrose Avenue and who his victims were.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.